So welcome to today's lecture in which we are going to discuss about the nature of charisma and the routinization of charisma, which is the idea of Max Weber. So in this lecture, basically we are going to discuss two important aspects related to Weber, the nature of charisma and routinization of charisma. As part of this lecture, we also would include Thomas Odia's idea about the institutionalization of religion and the dilemmas that come with institutionalization. So let us now begin with the nature of charisma. In one of his major works titled Economy and Society, which was published posthumously in 1922, that means it was published after his death. The manuscripts were there, but Weber couldn't publish during his lifetime. Later somebody edited and published it. So in this particular work titled Economy and Society, Weber distinguishes three types of authority. And these three types of authority have three different sources from which they derive the authority. So that is what makes them different one from another. Now these three different authorities, which are derived from three different sources, are, according to Weber, legal, traditional, and charismatic. Now, we are familiar with this idea of legal authority. We are also probably familiar with this charismatic authority. And traditional authority is something that we probably may not much have heard, but that is a very important notion according to Weber. Now, what is legal authority? Legal authority is exercised according to certain rationally organized mechanisms and laws. For example, the Prime Minister of this country has a legal authority, and how this is rationally organized based on the constitution of this country, because the laws are rationally devised. They are not just arbitrarily done, they are well thought out, they are well worked out, and based on that he has a legal authority. So not only the Prime Minister, there are different officials in this country, they all hold a legal position. They have certain authority over us that is granted by the law. The law here is basically, in a democratic political system, is the constitution. So we also have different other officials, different ministers, or within the state we have got also the chief minister and other ministers, but we also have a judicial system. All of them have legal authority in their respective areas, which is defined by the constitution. So the source is based on the rationally devised legal system, the laws. Now, traditional authority is an authority that is derived from a traditionally sanctioned role. For example, parents have a certain authority over their children. Now, it's not because there is any legal code for it. Nobody has written a law about it, but it is something that is traditionally accepted. Parents by nature have certain roles like this. They have a certain authority over their children in order to raise them. And in a typical monarchy where the king is the ruler, again the authority is traditional, not legal, because it has been a tradition. There is one king who ruled over the people. It is not based on any constitutional law, but merely it is a tradition that people have accepted. So these are some of the examples of the traditional authority. So Weber's innovation is precisely in bringing here a third kind of authority, which he called charismatic authority. Now, what is a charismatic authority? The charismatic authority is not derived from any rational devised laws like constitution, nor does it assigned to you by the tradition, but it is purely based on the person's charisma. Now we have heard about, you also speak about the charisma of your particular religious order. So you know what charisma is. So depending on that charisma, that individual gains certain authority. Now according to Weber, charisma is a particular kind of quality, or a particular kind of quality that is possessed by an individual who is normally regarded as having certain qualities that are exceptional. He is not like every other person. Sometimes often associated with certain supernatural qualities. These are not accessible to ordinary persons because they are exemplary. And on the basis of these qualities, these people are naturally accepted as leaders in a given society. Now you do have, for example, people began to recognize a certain authority in the person called Jesus. Not because he had any legal position, not because he had any authority assigned by the tradition like many of the religious leaders had at that time, but people were attracted to him and then recognized in him a leader. Somehow they found in him a certain trait of authority which is very different from legal and traditional. Now Jesus is one such example. You can think about not only religious leaders like Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha. You can also think about many other leaders, like for example Gandhi is another example. He is not a religious leader, but people recognize a certain charisma in him, not because he had supernatural qualities, but he had certain exceptional powers. At least people recognized in him. We can debate whether that is okay, what they recognize is right or not is another thing. But people do recognize even in individual leaders, or a leader of a movement, for example. You may have suddenly many followers. And these are the charismatic figures. Religion obviously arises from the charismatic authority. Religion does not arise from the legal authority. Religion does not arise from traditional authority. But obviously it arises from the charismatic authority, particularly the historical religions or the religions of the book like Judaism, Christianity and Islam. Judaism did not have a particular leader, but obviously they go back always to the figure of Moses, for example. So it is not that Moses founded, or Abraham for that matter. It is not because Abraham founded the religion or anything, but they recognized in him a charismatic leader in a personality called Abraham. The historical part of it, there can be debated, that's not the point. But there is something, there is in some people they find something, and over a period of time they recognize in the prophets who kept that religion alive in many different ways. The prophets were not traditionally, they were not accepted, they are not given any role by the tradition, nor do they have any legal standing. That is why the prophets were often killed. Now some of these characteristics of this charismatic authority would involve, it belongs to the person. Charisma belongs to the particular person which is recognized by the people. So it is deeply personal. So it is an attribute of the person, certain traits that are very specific to that person. Another important characteristic of this charismatic authority is this charismatic authority is oftentimes revolutionary. So Jesus, he was a revolutionary. Who is a revolutionary? A revolutionary is a one who challenges and tries to change the existing system. He tries to turn upside down what is believed, what is practiced. In that sense, it is subversive. Now, what is the meaning of subversive? Subversive is you just exactly place something upside down, you roll something upside down, you change it totally, something different from what is normally accepted, and therefore it is very prophetic. Now you remember the words of Jesus, for example. I am referring to the words of Jesus. It can be applied to Buddha, or it can be applied to Muhammad. Since you are more familiar with Jesus, it has been written, an eye for an eye. Okay, that is what is normally you accept. But I say to you, anyone he hates his brother is not worthy of the kingdom. You may have a certain accepted practices and beliefs, but I say otherwise. Exactly the opposite of it. There's no question of eye for an eye. That is subversive. That is revolutionary. So don't think Jesus was a kind of an obedient, religious guy that you may like to portray him to be. He was a great, menace to the existing religious order of his time, and that's what all the prophets did. And that is, Jesus is also prophetic in that sense. All the teachings of Jesus are subversive teachings. We fail to recognize that. You know why we fail to recognize that? We are now so used to that subversive thing has become a normal thing, so we fail to recognize it. I give you a simple example. How many times you have heard the parables of Jesus? Now, what is the purpose of a parable? The purpose of a parable is to disturb you. So we are very comfortable reading the parables of Jesus because we really don't understand the meaning of it very often. Because the characters that are said in the parables are not something that we hold in high regard. Because we already have different meaning given to that particular character. Take for example the parable of the publican and the Pharisee. It's only one example. You can think of any other parable. I'm just giving you one example to make you understand. You remember the famous parable of the Pharisee and the publican going to pray? I'm sure you know. So the Pharisee walks right inside and then says, I thank you, God, for not making me a sinner, or like this person who is standing outside is praising and thanking God. Fine, great. And there is a poor publican who is standing outside saying, Lord, have mercy on me, I am a poor sinner. This parable doesn't disturb us. The reason is very simple, because we already have in our mind a Pharisee means a bad man. But not for the Jewish listeners in the time of Jesus. A Pharisee is someone whom the Jews held in high esteem. A publican is the one who is the worst kind of sinner. Who is a publican? Somebody who was collecting tax for the foreign rulers. Somebody who is backstabbing them. Somebody who is completely abominable, doing the work which is very dirty. So you cannot betray your own people, to make money. You see? So for Jews, when they hear that, it is not the Pharisee's prayer that is heard, but is that publican's prayer that is heard. It is very, very disturbing. Now that doesn't disturb us because we have a completely different meaning for Pharisee and publican, because we are so used to that meaning. So let me now revise that parable. Now you attribute any person. I tell you this. Okay, you have got a founder, foundress, whoever it is. Your founder or the foundress and a sex worker from the local neighborhood go to the church. And your founder thanks and praises God for all the gifts and the graces that God has showered for the ministry and all that she or he could do, and for the number of occasions the congregation receives. And the poor sex worker is trying to say, I am a sinner, forgive me. And if I tell you it is a prayer of the sex worker that is listened, not that of your founder or foundress, how disturbing would that be? I'm sure you will try to come and attack me. Exactly, that's what they did to Jesus. They were trying to kill him. Because that is very disturbing to hear, you are insulting a religious leader to say, my religious leader's prayer is not heard. This publican who is betraying us, his prayer is heard. He is closer to God. Now you understand the parable better if you appropriate to the context. If I tell you it is not your founder's or founder's prayer that is heard, but the poor sex worker's prayer that is heard, it is potentially subversive. Jesus was a dangerous man of his time. Charismatic authority is that way dangerous because they are very subversive, they are prophetic, they bring about revolution. The third important characteristic of the charismatic authority is, by the way, the example that is given is by me, not by Max Weber. The idea is Max Weber. I am giving you examples so that you can understand. Okay, so don't say that Max Weber said about the parable and so on. I gave the example of the parable so you can understand that what he means by subversive, revolutionary, or prophetic. The third important characteristic of the charismatic authority is that the charismatic authority is oftentimes spontaneous. Now, when we speak about spontaneity, a certain aspect of unpredictability is involved. Obviously, the Jews could not, even the followers of Jews could not predict what Jesus is going to do. Suddenly, he will tell the disciples, come, we will walk through the Samaritan village. Really? Samaritan village? We are, inimical to Samaritans. Why do you want to go there? It's a very spontaneous act. People cannot, even his close disciples cannot predict him. You know how many times they had to debate with him. He suddenly will say, Son of Man has to go to Jerusalem and handed up to death. Peter would say, no, what are you talking? You're talking rubbish. You see? Very unpredictable statements. That is because a charismatic authority does not follow anyone. He makes his own statements according to the situation. He doesn't have any plan that is laid down and given to him. He doesn't have a constitution to live by. He creates his own plans according to a given situation. Therefore, he makes statements in a given situation by understanding that signs of the times. That's why he is spontaneous and unpredictable. The fourth important characteristic is the charismatic authority is always forward looking. It is not about looking back towards the past. You see, our past heritage is like this, we have been doing. That's what exactly the other religious leaders in this time were doing. Are you greater than Moses and Abraham and all these things? These are all past. The charismatic authority looks forward to what is to come, not what is gone by. The fifth characteristic of the charismatic authority is the charismatic authority involves a community. There is a certain community that develops around him or her. And oftentimes, this community is informal. There is no rigid community lifestyle. There is no time for morning prayer, noon prayer, evening prayer, meals time. They are just very informal. Because it is an informal community, that takes us to the last characteristic of the charismatic authority. Economic activity is not an important concern of the charismatic authority or the informal community that develops around him. Perhaps that is the least of the concerns. Well, they may like to have some food list and so on, but that is not the focus. So you see, these are the 6 important characteristics that Weber tries to speak to us about the charismatic authority. I repeat these 6 characteristics, very personal, which is recognized by the people. The charismatic authority is not by virtue of a particular legal status or a tradition. It belongs to the person, which obviously people recognize. Second, of course, the charismatic authority is very revolutionary, subversive, and prophetic. The third, the charismatic authority is spontaneous and unpredictable because he does not follow anyone. He makes his own statements, makes his own preaching in a given situation. Fourth, the charismatic authority is always forward looking, not a prisoner of the past. Fifth, the charismatic authority involves a community, but a formal community. Economic activity is not a main concern. Now, when you look at this charismatic authority, it goes very well with the life of Jesus. At least, originally how he was, the historical point of view, perhaps may not be the way we would like to present it. There is a nice series. I don't know whether you have heard of that, but if you have not heard of that, it is available free. The first season is already there. all of you are using a mobile phone, I know that. So it's not very difficult. You go to the Google Play Store and look for the Chosen app. The Chosen is a series. It is free of cost, given based on some donations of the people. It's about the life of Jesus. First season is already complete. It has got many episodes. They are planning for 4 seasons. They are still working on it. Yeah, some of you heard it. Now, if you look at that, you will find many of these, Jesus is presented pretty much along these lines. He's very spontaneous, he's very forward-looking, he's very subversive, very prophetic in that sense. And, some of these ideas are very, very powerfully brought out in there, unlike the traditional films that are made on Jesus, making him completely distant, very different kind of human being. So it doesn't show it in that light. So if you have seen that, fine. If you have not seen that, you could watch that in your given time. That is our personal thing, not for this course. Now this is the nature of charisma. Now that we know the nature of charisma, let us now try and look at the routinization of charisma. The question that inevitably comes to our mind is, why is there a routinization of charisma? The problem is, the charismatic authority is not immortal. The charismatic authority is mortal. But then there is already a community that is developed around this charismatic authority. When that charismatic authority dies, it creates a vacuum. And therefore there is a problem in the structure of authority. In other words, there is a crisis of continuity. Somebody has to continue the role that the charismatic authority has been doing so that the community continues to remain. Because it is important, because the community is developed around certain ideals, and that those ideal concerns are to be continued. So therefore, what was personal to that charismatic authority now becomes an institution. You need to create a structure of authority so that you can continue the vision and the ideal of the charismatic authority around which the community has developed. So something personal now gets institutionalized. Now once something, sometimes, they say this often in theology, the preacher became preached. So you no longer, it's no longer Jesus was the preacher. Now he was preaching something, and now you begin to preach him. That is the part of the institutionalization. And because you preach him, your preaching style changes. You remember the charismatic authority is, very revolutionary. Therefore, his preaching is, it has been said to you, but I say to you, that is to do otherwise. Now, the preaching is, it has been said to you by our leader, so do likewise. There is no revolution anymore. So it becomes now conservative. It becomes traditional. So the disciples cannot preach as Jesus. Jesus was prophetic in his teaching. What does a prophet does? The prophet challenges the existing system. But the preaching of the disciples becomes priestly. Now, what do we mean by priestly? The priest is not someone who can challenge the existing system. The priest becomes the spokesperson of the existing system. The priest wants to keep the existing status quo as it is. The prophet can stand outside and challenge it. Whereas the priest will completely conform to the system. So he has to justify that. So what was spontaneous in the charismatic authority, when you routinize the charisma, when you institutionalize the charisma, it becomes standardized and predictable. What was forward looking became backward looking. what was originally an informal community becomes now a formal hierarchy. You create a structure where there are specific functions and positions assigned to people. Now, when you have a formal structure like this in terms of hierarchy, a community that is well organized, economic activity becomes a central concern. It's not any longer that you are very spontaneously leading your life. You need to organize your life, and for that you need to have economic activity. So how much of time you would be spending in discussing how we can make money to run our institution, run our congregation, run our diocese? That was probably hardly what Jesus would have thought. This is known as the routinization of charisma. So the charisma is very different when it gets routinized. The charisma gets tamed. In fact, the charisma is even, obliterated. It is almost annihilated. Because of the loss of charisma, the routinization happens. Because the moment institutionalization happens, the institution becomes primary, not the charisma. Because your concern is to somehow to defend the institution, to maintain the institution, and you become very, very concerned about status quo, not challenging the system, but maintaining the status quo. And therefore economic activity becomes very important. So you begin to claim certain things in the name of tradition. You are very far backward looking. You see, that is our tradition, we cannot give it up. All kinds of infight that sometimes we have, unnecessarily wasting everybody's time and resources. That is the problem with routinization of charisma. Now, what does this institutionalization imply? Weber thinks at least there are three important implications with regard to this institutionalization. The first implication is about the power structure. Now that the charismatic authority doesn't exist, who has the authority? We have to find a suitable replacement. We have to find someone who has the power to exercise the authority. So therefore you create a power structure. Now this power structure can be sometimes seen in terms of heredity. Normally when the charismatic authority has some close relatives, they would succeed to that. Now for example, one of the problems in our political parties is oftentimes the family members take over. The father must have started a party, maybe with a good purpose and so on. They must be very charismatic, people rallied around him. Obviously, when he goes away, the problem now, who would inherit this power? So the power structure is in crisis. Who has the authority? Who has the power to exercise the authority? So the charismatic leadership becomes very hereditary. Or sometimes you may look for a tradition. Like you have this Dalai Lama. So you have to find a new Dalai Lama based on certain traditional practices. So this is the first implication for power structure. The second implication is the recruitment structure. As long as the charismatic leader was there, he has the charisma to attract people. So people would simply flock. They would join in huge number. They would follow him. There's no problem about it. Now, you need to somehow make sure that you get people. What do? You arrange some recruitment structure. So you organize vocation camps. You organize ways in which you can baptize more people to join your flock. You organize different programs. This is called the recruitment structure, to recruit more people into your system. If it is for a religion, normally you organize some programs so that you can get more people to receive baptism, join your religion. Or if it is a particular congregation, you organize a vocation camp. So it is not that people are simply madly following the charismatic leader because of the charisma that they could feel, but you have to systematically organize it and lure people into that somehow. There is a crisis. Otherwise, people won't join. You no longer have the charisma with you. The third implication is the legitimate structure. Now that you have made an institution, you need to have a structure to legitimate the institution that you have. What is an institution? An institution is a structure, a social structure that you have created with some shared expectations. So based on these shared expectations, you need to create certain ways in which you can legitimate the ways you live. In order to legitimate that, you have to create creed, code, and cult. 3 C's. Creed, code, and cult. Every religion would have a certain creed that will say this is the shared expectations for us for everyone to be a believer. You would have a code, some things that you consider as the law that you need to follow. You will have the 10 commandments. You will have the 6 precepts of the church. And if you want to make it more complex, you will have code of canon law. You see, you have to create a cult. You have to create some pattern, some structure for worship. Whether it is para-liturgical, liturgical, sacramental, whatever it is, you may have different of these things. I'm sure you know that more than I do. You see, you need to have some cult to legitimate the structure. So you have 3 implications. There is a power structure. The power structure is, now who has the authority? Who has the power to exercise the authority? It is by heredity or by tradition. Of course, in the Catholic Church, it has certain tradition. We have established a certain tradition by which the hierarchy is institutionalized. You need to have a recruitment structure because there is no longer the charisma available. People are not going to automatically follow you and join you. So you need to create programs and plans to recruit more members into your fold, including vocation camps. Third, you need to have a structure to legitimate your institution, that is called legitimate structure. And this is often done with the creed, code, and cult. And therefore, the roles and norms and the social position are all well demarcated. Okay. Now, Weber says there are 2 forms of institutionalization in Christianity. These 2 forms of institutionalization are churches and sects. Now, churches are basically about the mainline churches like the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the Lutheran Church. These are all churches. Then you also have sects. I don't know how many are there. There are so many. There are different types of Pentecostal groups, the evangelicals and the Salvation Army or whatever it is. There are very many different sects. So there are 2 ways in which institutionalization can happen. Now the difference between the churches and the sects are the following. Churches are normally large, big in number. That is why you call them a church. You have got a huge membership in the church. Millions of people probably. Sects, normally they are small. They are very kind of small little local area thing. It's not having a huge appeal for membership. The churches get members from different strata of the society. You will have rich people, you have got poor people, you have got all kinds of people. People with a high education background, people with a low education background, people who are of a certain status in the society, people who have no status in the society. I mean status, I mean here the social status, the economic status, or even political status. So you can have all kinds of people you will find in churches. In sects, mostly from his study, he has shown the membership is normally formed by the lower strata of people. Normally people who are poor, who have no much respect in the society, people who are not much accepted in the common places and so on. The sects are mostly attract these people. In church, the membership is normally automatic. Automatic means you are born of a parents who follow that particular church, you automatically become there. Even if you are baptized young age or late age, you are still a church goer. You just follow what your parents do. It happens very naturally, automatically. Whereas in the sects, mostly the membership is by new converts. So that's why you see the sects can be very aggressive about getting more people in preaching, and you'll find the sects people going and preaching and converting people and so on is very commonly seen. The fourth difference between the church and the sects is the churches have hierarchical power structure. There is a clear hierarchy, starting from the lowest one to the highest one. Obviously, the highest one being, for the Catholic Church, the Pope. There is a famous joke. There was a dialogue between a Catholic and a Jew, and they were speaking about each religion, the powerful position they have in their religion and so on. So the Jew was amazed and asked the Catholic, what would be a high position in your church? He said, well, to become a priest. And to be above that, well, you then become a bishop. Then above that maybe archbishop. Then above that, maybe cardinal. Above that, pope. And above that, what can a Catholic become really in the highest position in the church? Above pope, nothing above. What can he become? Then the Jew said, oh, okay, that's all. One of our Jewish chaps even became God in your religion. So, you see, the hierarchical power structure is this is supposed to be a joke, by the way, what I said. One of our Jewish chaps became God in your religion. He is referring to Jesus. So, the hierarchical power structure is very common in the mainline churches. Now, as much as we have, the Catholic Church and hierarchical power structure, every other church has. For example, the Anglican Church, the Queen of England is the head of the church. Okay, then you have got others come after her, and finally the common and normal lay people. And in the sects, you don't have such rigid power structure. It's rather flexible. It's just there is one pastor and everybody else around him, they make decisions collectively because it's a small group. So it's not, there is very strictly, there is no such power structure that is in place. Also, along the same line, the fifth distinction is about the power structure. In the few churches, the power structure is centralized. You see, look at even our own, institutions or your own congregations. You got a centralized power structure. So finally, everything has to be approved by somebody holding the power in the center, meaning to say, your mother general or somebody. So it's very centralized, and also in the Catholic Church, it's a very centralized approach. So very less of autonomy. Whereas in the sects, the congregations are mostly autonomous. They don't have any such centralized power structure. The sixth distinction between the churches and the sects is the churches easily compromise with the world because they got certain interest to protect. So you would easily compromise with the ruling class. It doesn't matter for you. You kind of try to please them, appease them, and you will nicely quote biblical texts. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and so on, to justify what we do, because we want to strike a nice chord with them so that we can achieve what we want to achieve. Because we have an institution at hand, we don't want to take any risk. So easily we compromise. The sects normally they don't easily compromise. They even reject. Because they have nothing much to lose. After all, they have not much institution to worry about. So they will just be they can be a little more challenging to people in the ruling position. That is why the early church was not compromising, because it was not an institution. The early Catholic Church was not compromising. It was not an institution. So if you look at the history of the church, the early church was very strongly challenging the ruling class. Only when the church emerged to be an institution, became part of the ruling, then it began to make compromise, because now it has become very institutionalized. The seventh distinction is, in the churches, which is normally large, grace is always mediated. you need someone having special function to mediate God's grace. So you need priest. Priest becomes important in the Catholic Church, for example, or for that matter in the Anglican Church. The pastor becomes important because the grace is mediated through someone. You cannot have a direct experience of God's grace. Whereas in the small churches, grace is normally immediate. You don't need such any mediation of any priest or anything. In fact, they don't have this idea of priest. There is a little local pastor, he knows a little bit more Bible than you do, but for that matter, any one of the congregation members can become a pastor. It's not a big deal in a small sect, not in the huge churches. Now, these are the two ways in which institutionalization takes place. Now, obviously, Weber is talking from the Western context where he is aware of the Christian denominations and the Christian churches. He is not thinking of other religions, but it could be pretty much the same in other religions as well, with minor differences, obviously. Particularly, this would be true of all historical religions. Now that we have discussed the nature of charisma, and also we have discussed the routinization of charisma, meaning the institutionalization of charisma, these both are ideas of Weber. Now, how in the institutionalization the charisma gets lost? Now, the third aspect of this dilemmas of institutionalization, I am going to discuss the ideas of Thomas Odeya from his book, The Sociology of Religion. Thomas Odeya was born 1915 and lived up to 1974. So he comes in the tradition of Weber. That means he follows Weber's ideas and adds his own to that. So let us try to look at what he speaks about. What are the dilemmas that we have in institutionalization? You know the meaning of dilemma. There is some kind of conflicting situation in the institutionalization. So particularly Thomas Odeya focuses on the dilemmas of institutionalization within the Catholic Church. But then he tries to give a more explanation of the phenomena as well. But he starts looking at the Catholic Church. Okay. He also, looks into the Weber's insights of routinization of charisma. He also looks at Parsons' discussion on de-institutionalization. Parson is another sociologist. So I have not discussed all of them for want of time, but it's maybe important. Sorry, it is Parson, not Parsons. That yes is not there. Parsons, understanding of deinstitutionalization. He is also influenced by another important study that is done by Troeltsch. Troeltsch study of the distinction between the church and the sect. So based on all that, he comes to form his understanding about the dilemma of institutionalization. Odeya created a conceptual scheme in order to understand the factors that contribute to the functioning of religious movements and organization. Now, along the functioning of the religious movements organization, he also includes the change, the process of change that happens within the religious movements and organization. So, Odeya identified 5 dilemmas that are structurally inherent in the institutionalization of religion. You cannot escape it. They are part and parcel of. Inherent means they are part and parcel of it. You have no escape from them. So at least 5 types of dilemmas that are structurally inherent in the institutionalization of religion or the religious institutionalization. The first one is the dilemma of mixed motivation. Now, this is very familiar to us, the dilemma of mixed motivation. Now, you see, one of the problems with the institutionalization, as we noticed, is the institutionalization tends to produce more specialized functions and roles. For example, in the Catholic Church, we have specific roles for priests, specific roles for religious men and women, and they have offices, they have roles. Now, obviously, because of these specialized offices and roles that are created, there are original goals, values, and motives which is inspired by the charisma of the charismatic authority, now tends to become more and more worldly. It begins to focus on the worldly things more and more. So the organization is faced with the question of whether to adapt to this or how to adapt to this in the widening of the members' motives. So, for example, the member would probably join a religious order because the member realizes that if I join the religious order, not because the original goal of the charismatic authority can be relived, but because I can get to occupy an important position. I can get to be the principal of a school. Otherwise, I will probably never get in my life. You see, sometime one day somebody interesting told me, it's sometimes very annoying. Many of these religious people occupying this posts of principal and of schools and colleges, they are much less qualified than many of us lay people. But that's because they happen to be religious, they occupy that role and they make a mess of things and they have no idea what they are doing. Very true. Because there is a mixed motivation. People may join a particular organization for a particular purpose, which is very different from the original goal and the values, because there is a mixed motivation that emerges that is structurally inherent in religious institutionalization. You cannot avoid it. Now, this is because the dilemma of mixed motivation. This is by Thomas Odeya. The second dilemma that Thomas Odeya speaks about is the symbolic dilemma. Now, what is a symbolic dilemma? The original sacred experience, is normally expressed through a certain symbols, which are normally symbolic objects. Now, why they began to be expressed in certain symbols? Because they spontaneously created certain awe and respect towards those symbols. But now that those symbols are structuralized, they are symbols everybody should accept, and the rituals that are accompanying those symbolic practices, they become ritual, as they become routinized. This original symbol, the symbol that points to the original sacred experience, now becomes alienated from the believer. So that is a symbolic dilemma. The symbol was supposed to give expression to the original sacred experience. But now that it is, routinized, not only the symbols but also the rituals that are created around those symbols, they become very routinized. These symbols, they don't evoke the same sacred experience as it was originally evoking. So it is alienated now from the believer. This is known as a symbolic dilemma, which very often, very many religions undergo. There's the question of symbolism. Very many times we don't even know what the symbolism is, we just keep repeating that. There are certain symbols that we do in the Catholic Church which probably it's time that we reconsider. Some of them, I will explain to that during the discussion time. The third dilemma is the dilemma of administrative order. Now, what is the dilemma of the administrative order? Because of the institutionalization, There is also a need for creating bureaucratic offices. So we function exactly like a bureaucracy. I mean, religious institution also begins to function like a bureaucracy because of the efficiency. We want to be efficient. So the expansion of this bureaucracy typically follows, from a certain way in which offices are maintained and the office holders are alienated from the ordinary believers. Because then you create a certain bureaucratic ways of doing things. If you want to meet somebody in the hierarchy, there are certain procedures to be followed. You cannot easily have access. The more and more you create bureaucracy, the more and more you get alienated from your people who are part of the religion. I mean, the common believer. I mean, that could happen in any circumstance, in any institutionalization. The larger the bureaucracy, the more complicated the bureaucracy, the more alienation is bound to happen from the laity. So this is the dilemma of the administrative order. Why? There is a certain need for an elaboration of your administration. Therefore, the bureaucracy comes into practice. And because there is certain bureaucracy that comes into practice, there is going to be more and more alienation. Now, you know the example. Suppose if you want to meet your Mother Superior, Mother General, it's not going to be an easy thing. You may have to first perhaps take an appointment and then call the secretary or things like that. There's a lot of things. Fine, that's fine. But then people find sometimes very cumbersome. To meet a bishop, you have to first take an appointment with the secretary who will give an appointment to meet the bishop. You see? And sometimes you will never get one. So, you will never have an access. So this is exactly the dilemma of administrative order. So it is very much like the political system as well. You will never get to see the big boss, or even if you write a letter, it would never reach the person. So you write a letter, the secretary decides to give or not to give. So you may simply throw in the trash. Well, that is the dilemma of the administrative order. The fourth dilemma is the dilemma of delimitation. What is the dilemma of delimitation? This is a very commonly known dilemma for us. We may not be knowing that by that name. There is a way in which we tend to substitute the spirit with the letter. In other words, the fact that institutionalization emerged, there is a certain code, there is a certain creed, there is a certain cult, accompanied by certain theology for all of these things. Because they are meant to somehow embody the religious insights. But they are supposed to embody the insights which are supposed to inspire us. But then we tend to literally take them. We somehow reduce its scope and depth to the letter of what is said. Not the spirit of what is said, but the letter of what is said. And therefore, you can end up being too fundamentalist, too dogmatic, too rigid in your structure. That is known as the dilemma of delimitation, because you are limiting the scope and the depth of the original religious message. So it no longer holds any relevance for the believers. It simply is now stuck with too much of rigidity. Instead of taking the spirit of that message, we tend to take the letter very seriously. Letter means literally. So we say it has to be there. You have a rule here in our congregation, 7 o'clock evening prayer, all of us should be there. No question asked. Or we have a rule, only once in 3 years you are allowed to go home. Well, my grandmother is very seriously ill. No, only parents will allow, not grandparents. But my grandmother is the one who raised me. No, according to our rule, only the parents. No, I didn't have parents. My grandmother raised me. No, only parents. That is the let I'm talking about. Now, I'm giving an example that you can connect to immediately. I'm not therefore saying it happens only within that kind of system. It can happen in the larger religious system, We become very, very dogmatic, very fundamentalist in our approach. Holding the letter of the law, not seeing the spirit of the law, what that is supposed to embody. So this happens definitely in institutionalized religion, the dilemma of delimitation. We are all aware of this, we are all some way victims of this, and sometimes we are also victimizers of this, meaning to say we could have victimized some people by this dilemma of delimitation. Then the last dilemma he is speaking is the dilemma of power. What do we mean by this dilemma of power? The dilemma of power can be understood in terms of contrasting the idea of conversion with the idea of coercion. Okay? Coercion means something that is done forcefully. Conversion is supposed to be done that is willingly. So that is the dilemma of power. Conversion versus coercion. Let me explain that a little more in detail. In the early history of religious movement or organization, the individuals, believers, they normally began to demonstrate their faith commitment through an act of conversion, meaning to say it is spontaneous from their part. They say, okay, I find this meaningful, I try to embrace this and so on. That is how earlier time it happened. But over time, with the institutionalization, in order that we need to maintain and strengthen the status of institution, we tend to become very closely aligned with other state powers and draw upon the power of the state to support its goals. The Catholic Church did that very powerfully during the medieval times. You align with the kings, and then you kind of draw power of the state to support your ends. So colonization, for example, the political, West political rulers, the kings, they had a way of colonizing, and the church sanctioned it by saying, well, it can support my goal of converting people. That's not conversion, that is coercion. So you divide, into east and west, and the Portuguese go here, the Spanish go the other direction, and you colonize fine, but you also convert people in the process. I align with you, I support your cause, you support my cause. That is aligning with the secular path. It can happen even today in different ways, very subtly, it may not be that explicit. So therefore, this will increase the membership, obviously, because the people may not like to oppose the state power anyways. So the stronger you are tied up to, this kind of secular power allies, this may also foster certain cynicism and even secularization among the people. But this is the dilemma of power, so you somehow rely on aligning with the because you somehow want to exercise the power that you have, but through aligning with the secular power. So it is not something that you are appealing to people naturally and spontaneously, but somehow you are taking the support of another power structure. These are the 5 types of institutionalization that Thomas Odeya speaks about. Now, to conclude this particular lecture, I just want to say these institutionalizations are sometimes very harmful. Religious institutionalizations are even more harmful, precisely because it not only makes us go away from the original charisma, but also sometimes turn us against the original charisma itself. So we can end up taming the original charisma. We can end up taming the original message. Jesus was powerfully a challenging prophet, powerfully revolutionary. What did you do in your theology? You made him the priest, a royal priest, somebody who would support the status quo. If at all Jesus was something, he was against all that kind of that priesthood thing in the Jewish religion. But then you made him a priest. Probably he's because there's a typical expression, no? The first priest or the greatest of priests. Something is there. Anyway, he's a royal priest, and we are all participating in the priesthood of Jesus. You see how much we are capable of doing harm to the original charisma of the charismatic authority. For us to think about. Again, however, it is also to be kept in mind, institutionalization cannot be avoided. If you want to somehow save the charisma, you may have to institutionalize. Otherwise, the charisma anyway has a natural death. But you also should realize, however institutionalization may be necessary, institutionalization is also necessarily corruptive. It corrupts us. So it is time and again for us important, even if there is certain institutionalization that takes place, we should not become victims of that. We should not become prisoners of that. Try to go back to the original charisma and always renew ourselves. Otherwise, we are in the danger. Danger of fundamentalism, danger of dogmatism. Most of the problems that we have are kind of naive, stupid problems, which are no problem at all liturgical problems. Whether we should do this first, whether we should do that first, whether we should face the altar, whether we should face the people, whether we should, amount of time wasted on this. Whether you should keep flowers on the altar, or whether we should keep candle there, where you should keep all this. Okay, fine, it's okay, that information is good to know. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but you cannot debate on these things endlessly. As if that is what is, what Jesus wanted. And this man never celebrated a mass as the way we celebrate. All that he did was celebrate a Last Supper, a meal with, supper. The Last Supper is what we commemorate as a mass. And I'm sure he did it in a much more, inspirational way, that all that structured way which we do. And then we get very, very, very kind of disillusioned about a minor change and so on. Anyway, this is my concern about it. More of that we will discuss we will have a discussion during the discussion time. With this, I will end today's lecture. I am opening up for discussion. Thank you.